Picture this. The year is 201 million years ago, and the ground under your feet is literally splitting open. Not in some slow, gentle geology textbook way. I mean a supercontinent the size of every modern landmass glued together is tearing apart at the seams. And out of those wounds in the earth comes an amount of poison that's hard to even put into words. This is how the Jurassic begins. Not with peace, not with sunshine and ferns and friendly long-necked giants munching leaves. It begins with the single most violent chapter the planet had seen in ages, a mass extinction that wiped out roughly 3/4 of everything alive. And the wild part? That catastrophe is the only reason the dinosaurs got their shot at ruling the world. So here's the deal, and this is your one and only heads up from me. If this kind of stuff makes your brain feel 3 sizes bigger, hit subscribe. We post these every single week. You can smack that bell too if you're the type. Cool? Cool. Now let me actually take you back there, because the Jurassic is one of those words everybody throws around without realizing how genuinely insane the whole thing was. Let's get the scale straight first, because numbers like this don't really land until you frame them right. The Jurassic period lasted about 56 million years. 56 million. Now, all of human civilization, the pyramids, Rome, the internet, you sitting on your couch right now, that whole story fits into something like 10 or 11,000 years if you're generous. Which means the Jurassic alone is long enough to fit everything humans have ever done more than 5,000 times over, back to back to back. Stack 5,000 entire human histories end to end, and you're still only just covering one geological period. That's the kind of time we're dealing with. When people say the dinosaurs ruled the Earth, they're not exaggerating for fun. They had time that makes our entire species look like a single afternoon. Okay, so back to the catastrophe, because you cannot understand the Jurassic without understanding the door it walked through to get here. Right before the Jurassic, you've got this giant landmass. Picture every continent you know: Africa, the Americas, Europe, Asia, Australia, Antarctica, all jammed together into one colossal slab of rock. Scientists call it Pangaea. One world, one supercontinent, surrounded by a single global ocean. And for a long time, it just sat there. But supercontinents are not stable forever. Underneath, the planet's heat has nowhere to escape, pressure builds, and eventually that slab starts to crack. And when it cracked, it didn't do it quietly. The splitting of Pangaea opened up enormous fissures in the crust, and through those fissures came volcanism on a scale you genuinely cannot picture. We're not talking about one volcano. We're talking about lava pouring out across an area the size of a continent, over and over, for thousands of years. And here's the number that should stop you cold. That event released somewhere around 100,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Let me put that in context for you, because that number is meaningless on its own. That's about 50 times everything humanity has ever pumped into the sky. Every car, every factory, every power plant, every flight, every single thing we've burned since the Industrial Revolution. Multiply all of that by 50. That's what the dying Pangaea coughed up into the air at the dawn of the Jurassic. And it wasn't just carbon dioxide. Here's the crazy part. Along with all that gas came mercury. Actual mercury poisoning, spread across the planet, baked into the rock layers that geologists dig up today. You can read it in the sediment like a crime scene report. The Earth was poisoning itself. The air heated up from all that carbon dioxide. The oceans turned acidic. The chemistry of the whole planet went haywire, and life simply could not keep up. When the dust settled, well, not the dust. The dust never really settled. But when the killing finally slowed down, roughly 76% of all species on Earth were gone. Just gone. 3 out of every 4 living things erased. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part people always get wrong. You probably grew up with this idea that dinosaurs took over because they were the biggest, the baddest, the toughest, the apex predators that simply outcompeted everything else. The superior design, the winners, right? You'd think the dinosaurs strutted onto the stage and beat everybody in a fair fight. And honestly, you're not alone in thinking that. But unfortunately, you are wrong. The dinosaurs didn't win because they were superior. They won the lottery. Let me explain. Before this extinction, dinosaurs were not the main event. They existed, sure, but they shared the world with all kinds of other big, successful animals. Relatives of crocodiles, weird armored reptiles, a whole cast of creatures that were doing just fine, thank you very much. Some of those other groups were arguably more dominant than the early dinosaurs. If you'd shown up at the end of that earlier age and bet on who'd inherit the planet, you might not have picked the dinosaurs at all. They were one option among many. But then the extinction came, and extinctions don't care about who's the strongest. They care about who can survive a catastrophe. And it just so happened that the early dinosaurs had a few traits that turned out to be golden tickets in that exact disaster. They tended to be small. They could burrow, which meant when the surface turned into a furnace, they could hide underground where it was cooler and more stable. And there's growing evidence that they were warm-blooded, or at least on their way to it, meaning they could regulate their own body temperature, ride out the wild swings in climate, stay active when slower, cold-blooded competitors were sluggish and dying. None of those traits are about being a magnificent giant predator. They're about being small, sneaky, and metabolically tough when the whole world is on fire. So the dinosaurs survived not because they were the kings of the old world, but because they happened to be holding the right hand of cards when the dealer flipped the table over. Everything else folded. They were left standing. And then, and this is the beautiful part, once the competition was cleared out, once all those rival groups had been wiped from the board, the dinosaurs had an empty planet to grow into. An entire world of vacant niches, no big competitors, nothing to stop them. And boy, did they grow. And that's why you should never confuse winning with being the best. The dinosaurs are the ultimate proof that sometimes survival is just about being the right shape at the right moment. Which just goes to show the asteroid of one age is the opportunity of the next. Now, with the world cleared out and the survivors free to expand, the Jurassic became the age of getting big. And I mean big in a way that has genuinely never happened before or since. Speaking of growth, let's talk about the sauropods, because if there's one image that defines the Jurassic, it's a creature with a neck like a crane and a body like a building, slowly moving across the landscape. The sauropods were the long-necked, long-tailed, pillar-legged giants. Think of the classic image of the dinosaur with the tiny head way up high on an impossibly long neck, the huge barrel body, the tree trunk legs. Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, the whole crew. These were not just big animals. These were the largest land animals that have ever existed on this planet, full stop. Not the largest of the Jurassic, the largest ever. Nothing before, nothing since, including everything alive today, comes close. The biggest of them grew past 70 tons. 70 tons of living animal walking around on four legs. To give you something to hang that on, a fully grown African elephant, the biggest land animal alive right now, the thing we point at and go, look how massive that is, weighs around 6 tons. So you're talking about an animal more than 10 times the weight of the biggest creature you could go see at a zoo today. Imagine 10.5 elephants fused into a single body, balanced on 4 legs, with a neck stretching up into the canopy. That walked, that ate, that lived its whole life carrying that around. And here's the part that gives me chills every time. These animals were not just big, they were right at the edge of what physics actually allows for a body that walks on land. There is a hard limit to how massive a land animal can get before its own weight crushes it, before its legs can't support the load, before its heart can't pump blood up that long neck against gravity, before the sheer engineering of being alive falls apart. And the sauropods walked right up to that line. They were pushing against the literal physical ceiling of biology. Go any bigger and the math stops working, the bones snap, the blood can't circulate, the body collapses under itself. They found the absolute maximum and they lived there. Think about what that means. Evolution, given 56 million years and an empty world, produced animals that maxed out the very rules of the universe for walking creatures. Not because something stopped them from getting bigger by competition, because nothing in life could get any bigger. Physics itself was the only thing that said, no further. That's how dominant the sauropods were. The only opponent they couldn't beat was gravity. And let me put you in the scene for a second, because the numbers are one thing, but the reality is another. Picture this. You're standing in a Jurassic forest. The air is warm and thick. The plants are these towering ferns and conifers and cycads. No flowers yet, no grass, just deep green everywhere. And the ground starts to shake. Not an earthquake, footsteps. Rhythmic, heavy, the kind of vibration you feel in your chest before you hear it. And then through the trees comes a wall of flesh, a neck rising up past the tallest branches, a head the size of a horse calmly stripping leaves 40 feet above the forest floor. It doesn't even notice you. You are to this animal less than an insect. That's the world the Jurassic built. A world where the biggest thing that has ever walked treated the tallest trees like a salad bar. Now, you can't have giant herbivores like that without something trying to eat them, and the Jurassic had its hunters too. But the relationship between predator and prey in this age produced some of the most spectacular weaponry in the history of life. And nothing shows that better than the next animal I want to introduce you to. Speaking of armed and dangerous, let's talk about Stegosaurus. You know this one. Even if you don't think you do, you know it. It's the dinosaur with the row of big diamond-shaped plates running down its back and the spiked tail. It's one of the most recognizable animals that ever lived. But there's so much more going on with this creature than the toy version suggests, and a couple of the facts about it are honestly hard to believe until you see the evidence. Let's start with that tail. The Stegosaurus had 4 big spikes at the end of its tail, sticking out sideways and back. For a long time, these spikes even had an unofficial nickname among paleontologists. They got called the thagomizer, which is a whole funny story on its own, but the point is, people argued for ages about what those spikes were actually for. Were they just for show? For attracting mates? For display? Or were they an actual weapon? And here's where it gets good. Here's the crazy part. We have proof. Direct, physical, smoking gun proof that those tail spikes were a real weapon used in real combat. Paleontologists found a vertebra, a piece of the backbone, from an Allosaurus, which was one of the big predators of the time, a serious meat-eater. And in that Allosaurus bone, there was a puncture wound, a hole. And when scientists measured that hole, the size and shape of it matched a Stegosaurus tail spike exactly, perfectly, like a key in a lock. Let that sink in. That is a moment frozen in stone. At some point in the Jurassic, an Allosaurus got too close to a Stegosaurus, and that Stegosaurus swung its tail and drove a spike clean through the predator's body, deep enough to leave a permanent mark on the bone, deep enough that the wound is still readable 150 million years later. We're not guessing. We're not speculating about what the spikes might have been for. We have the receipt. A predator with a Stegosaurus-shaped hole punched into its skeleton. The herbivore fought back, and we found the evidence. This is one of those things I love about paleontology, because it turns these animals from cartoons into real creatures that had real bad days. Somewhere out there, in the deep past, a hunter made a mistake, and a plant eater made it pay. And the proof sat in the rock waiting for us to dig it up and go, oh, so that's what those spikes were for. But the tail isn't even the weirdest thing about Stegosaurus, because you've probably heard, maybe as a fun fact, maybe as a joke, that the Stegosaurus had a second brain. A brain in its butt. A brain in its hips. And you'd be forgiven for assuming that's just one of those silly myths people repeat, the kind of thing that sounds too dumb to be true, right? You'd call me crazy if I told you it had 2 brains. Well, you're not totally wrong to be skeptical, but you're not totally right either. Let me explain. The Stegosaurus had a real, genuine anatomical feature in its hip region. In the area of the spine near its hips, the spinal cord was significantly enlarged. There was a noticeable cavity, a hollow space in the bone, where the nerve tissue swelled out to a size much bigger than you'd expect. For a long time, people interpreted this as a kind of second brain, the idea being that the animal's actual head brain was famously tiny, about the size of a walnut for a creature the size of a bus, so maybe it needed a backup processor down by the tail to control the back half of its enormous body. Now, modern scientists don't think it was literally a second thinking brain in the way your brain thinks, but, and this is the key part, the structure was absolutely real. That enlargement of the spinal cord existed. It's not a myth that there was something there. There was. And here's the genuinely fascinating twist. That same kind of enlargement in the spinal cord near the hips is found in modern birds. Living animals, right now, today, have a version of that exact structure. In birds, this region helps coordinate the back legs and balance. So the thing people laughed at as the silly second brain of the Stegosaurus is actually a real anatomical feature that connects this Jurassic giant directly to the birds flying around outside your window. The walnut-brained, spike-tailed tank had a body plan with echoes that are still alive today. And that, right there, is the thread I want you to hold on to, because it leads us to the single most important animal of the entire Jurassic. Not the biggest, not the most heavily armed, the most important. Because the Jurassic didn't just give us the largest land animals that ever lived and some of the most spectacular weaponry in natural history. It gave us the very first bird. And the story of how we know that is one of the greatest pieces of detective work in all of science. Now, let me set the stage. There's a place in Germany, in Bavaria, with a particular kind of limestone. This is a fine-grained, pale, beautiful stone that formed at the bottom of a calm Jurassic lagoon. And because the conditions there were so still and so gentle, things that fell into that lagoon and got buried were preserved in absolutely exquisite detail. Not just bones, impressions, soft details, the kind of preservation that almost never survives across geological time. This limestone is so good at capturing fine detail that it was historically quarried to make printing plates. That's how smooth and precise it is. And in that limestone, people started finding something extraordinary. They found Archaeopteryx. And here's a detail that I think is wild on its own. Every single one of the 12 known Archaeopteryx specimens, all 12, comes from that one limestone formation in Bavaria. Not scattered around the world, not found on different continents. One spot, one geological window into the past, in one region of Germany, is the source of essentially everything we know about this creature from direct fossils. 12 specimens, one formation. It's like the universe left a single doorway open into this exact moment of evolution, and that doorway happens to be in Bavaria. So what is Archaeopteryx? Okay, so this is where your brain should start tingling, because Archaeopteryx is a creature caught in the act. It is, almost literally, a snapshot of evolution mid-transformation. When you look at it, you see two animals fighting for the same body. On one hand, it had feathers, real, proper feathers, preserved in that fine limestone in stunning detail. You can see the individual barbs, the structure, the asymmetry that tells you these were feathers built for flight, not just for warmth or show. And it had wings, actual wings. From that angle, it looks like a bird. If you saw the feather impressions alone, you'd say, yeah, that's a bird, case closed. But then you look at the rest of it, and here's the crazy part. This animal had teeth, real teeth in its jaws. Birds today don't have teeth, they have beaks. And it had a long, bony tail. Not the little stub of tail feathers a modern bird has, but an actual long tail made of bone, like a reptile, like a small dinosaur. And it had claws on its wings, fingers sticking out of the front of those feathered limbs. So what you're looking at is an animal that is half reptile and half bird, stuck right in the middle of the crossing. Feathers and wings on one side, teeth and a bony tail and clawed fingers on the other. It is the in-between. It is the missing link people always talk about. Except it's not missing, we found it, 12 times, in a quarry in Germany. Archaeopteryx is the moment, frozen in stone, where the dinosaur was becoming the bird and hadn't finished yet. It still had one foot in each world. And think about what a gift that is. Evolution doesn't usually leave you a clean snapshot of the transition. Usually you get the before and the after, and you have to imagine the middle. But here, in this one perfect window in Bavaria, the Jurassic handed us the actual middle. The animal caught between what it was and what it was becoming. The first bird still wearing its reptile skin. Now this brings us to the single most mind-bending fact I can give you about the whole Jurassic, and honestly, about dinosaurs in general. And it's this: the dinosaurs never went extinct. Not entirely. I know, you've heard the asteroid, the end, the great die-off, the empty world. And that's a story for another chapter, what happened at the very end. But here's the thing that the Jurassic teaches you, the thing that Archaeopteryx is screaming at you across 150 million years. One branch of the dinosaurs didn't die, it transformed. It became birds. And birds are still here. Every bird alive today is a living dinosaur. I don't mean that as a poetic flourish like, oh, isn't that a nice way to think about it? I mean it as a literal statement of fact, in the same way that you are a living mammal. The lineage that runs from those small, feathered Jurassic dinosaurs through Archaeopteryx and onward never broke. It bent, it changed, it lost the teeth and the bony tail and the clawed fingers. It shrank and refined and took fully to the sky, but it never stopped. The pigeon on the sidewalk, the sparrow at your window, the chicken on your plate, the eagle riding the wind, those are dinosaurs. The same family tree. The branch that won the next lottery, just like their ancestors won the one that opened the Jurassic. Let that reframe the whole thing for you. When you pictured the Jurassic, the splitting continents, the poisoned air, the 70-ton giants pushing against the laws of physics, the spike-tailed tanks fighting off predators, the warm-blooded survivors crawling out of their burrows into an empty world, you're not looking at a dead, finished story. You're looking at the deep roots of a family that is still alive. The Jurassic isn't gone. Part of it is sitting on the telephone wire outside, singing. So let's pull back and really feel the arc of this age, because it's almost too perfect. The Jurassic opens with a planet tearing itself apart, a supercontinent splitting, 100,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide, mercury raining into the rocks, 3/4 of all life snuffed out. Out of that horror, by pure luck, a group of small, burrowing, warm-blooded survivors inherits an empty world. And over the next 56 million years, 5,000 human histories stacked end to end, they explode into the most spectacular creatures the land has ever held. They grow into 70-ton colossi that scrape the very ceiling of what physics permits. They evolve diamond-plated, spike-tailed warriors that can punch holes in their attackers. And then, at the edge of it all, in a quiet lagoon in what's now Germany, one small feathered branch lifts off the ground and becomes the first bird, teeth and tail and all, mid-leap between two kingdoms of life. That's the Jurassic. It began with catastrophe and ended with flight. It began with a world that nearly died and ended with a lineage that would, in one form, literally never die at all. And here's what I want you to sit with. Every single piece of that story we know because of evidence sitting in rock. The carbon dioxide and the mercury, read in the sediment layers. The 70 tons, measured from fossilized bone. The tail spike as a weapon, proven by a puncture wound in an Allosaurus vertebra that matches the spike exactly. The second brain, a real spinal enlargement, the same kind found in birds today. The first bird, 12 specimens from one Bavarian formation, feathers and teeth and bony tail all preserved together. None of this is made up. None of it is a guess. It's all there, in the stone, waiting. The Jurassic left us a paper trail across 150 million years, and every time we dig, we read another line of it. Now, let me circle back and go a little deeper on a few of these, because once you start pulling the threads, the whole tapestry gets richer. Take the extinction at the start again, because the mechanism matters, and it's genuinely chilling when you think about it in human terms. When you release that much carbon dioxide that fast, you don't just warm the planet a little. You trigger a cascade. The atmosphere heats. The oceans absorb a huge chunk of that gas, and when carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater, it turns the water acidic. And acidic oceans are death for anything that builds a shell or a skeleton out of calcium. Corals, shellfish, all kinds of marine life that form the base of the food web. So you don't just lose the animals directly cooked by the heat, you knock out the foundation of the ocean's entire economy, and everything that depends on it starves from the bottom up. That's how you get to 76%. It's not one killer, it's a chain reaction, each link pulling down the next. And the reason scientists are so confident about the mercury part specifically is worth appreciating because it's clever. Mercury, released by these massive volcanic events, gets spread through the atmosphere and then settles down and gets locked into the sediment that's forming at that time. So when geologists examine the rock layers from exactly the boundary where this extinction happened, they find spikes in mercury, sudden surges that line up perfectly with the timing of the die-off. It's chemical fingerprinting across deep time. The volcanoes left their poison signature in the rock, and we can date it and match it to the extinction. That's how we know it wasn't just carbon dioxide doing the killing, but a genuine planetary poisoning event running alongside the heat and the acid. And I keep coming back to the lottery framing because I think it's one of the most important lessons buried in all of this. We have this deep human instinct to assume that whatever ended up on top must have deserved it, must have earned it by being better. The dinosaurs ruled, so the dinosaurs must have been superior. But the actual story is humbling. The traits that saved the early dinosaurs, small size, the ability to burrow, warm-bloodedness, those weren't traits for dominating a stable world. Those were traits for surviving a collapsing one. In a normal, healthy ecosystem, being small might be a disadvantage. But when the world is ending, being small enough to hide, being able to dig down into cooler earth, being able to keep your body running no matter what the temperature does outside, those become the only things that matter. The dinosaurs weren't built to win. They were accidentally built to survive the specific apocalypse that happened. And that accident handed them the planet. And once they had it, okay, so think about what an empty world actually means for evolution. Normally, every animal is hemmed in. There's competition for every scrap of food, every patch of territory, every role in the ecosystem. You can't just evolve into something radically new because something's already doing that job and doing it well. But after a mass extinction, those jobs are open. The big herbivore role, vacant. The apex predator role, vacant. The everything role, vacant. So the survivors don't just slowly improve, they radiate. They explode outward into every empty niche, evolving wildly in all directions to fill the space. That's exactly what the dinosaurs did across the Jurassic. They went from a handful of modest survivors into the whole cast. The giant longnecks, the plated tanks, the big predators, the small feathered runners, because the world was wide open and there was nothing to stop them. The catastrophe that nearly killed everything was also the thing that unleashed the greatest burst of dinosaur evolution in history. Let's go back to those sauropods one more time, because I don't think the sheer absurdity of them lands fully on the first pass. 70 tons. At the physical edge of what a walking body can be. Now consider the engineering problems that come with being that big. Your heart has to pump blood all the way up a neck that might stretch many meters into the air, fighting gravity the whole way, just to reach the brain. The pressure required for that is staggering. Your bones have to support a weight that would shatter ordinary bone. So sauropod bones evolved to be partly hollow, full of air spaces, light but strong. A structure, by the way, that also shows up in birds. There's that connection again, popping up where you least expect it. Your gut has to process tons of low-quality plant food, so the body becomes essentially a giant fermentation vat on legs. Every part of being that big is a problem that physics throws at you, and the sauropods solved every single one of them, right up to the point where the problems became unsolvable. And then they stopped, because there was nowhere left to go. The ceiling of the possible. And here's a thought that I find genuinely beautiful. The reason nothing has ever gotten that big since, not the largest mammals, not the biggest creatures of any age that came after on land, isn't that the conditions never allowed for big animals again. It's that the sauropods had a unique combination of features, that hollow-boned, long-necked, efficient body plan that let them reach a size nothing else has ever matched on land. They are the all-time record holders, and the record has stood for over 100 million years, and as far as we can tell, it's never going to be broken, because the very laws of physics drew the line, and the sauropods are the only ones who ever reached it. The largest land animals that will ever exist already existed, back in the Jurassic. We live in the aftermath of the age of the truest giants. Now back to Stegosaurus and that incredible piece of detective work with the Allosaurus vertebra, because I want you to really appreciate how rare and special that kind of evidence is. Most of what we know about how extinct animals behaved is inference. We look at the shape of a tooth and guess at the diet. We look at the structure of a leg and guess at how it ran. We almost never get to see two animals actually interacting, because interactions don't fossilize. They happen in a moment, and then they're gone. But every so often, the rock preserves a frozen confrontation, a predator and prey locked together, a bite mark, or in this case, a puncture wound that matches a specific weapon. That Allosaurus vertebra with the Stegosaurus spike-shaped hole in it is one of those vanishingly rare windows where we get to watch the drama directly instead of guessing at it. It's not paleontology saying we think the spikes were weapons. It's paleontology saying, here is the wound, here is the weapon, here is the match. Case closed. The Stegosaurus defended itself, drew blood, drew bone, and the moment survived for us to find. And think about the everyday reality that implies. This wasn't a one-time freak event. If a Stegosaurus could land a hit solid enough to puncture an Allosaurus's spine, then these confrontations were happening regularly across the Jurassic. Predators stalking the big-plated herbivores, herbivores swinging those spiked tails like medieval flails, sometimes the predator winning, sometimes the prey landing a blow that ended the fight, or even ended the hunter. The plates and the spikes weren't decorations. They were the gear of an animal that lived in a dangerous world and came equipped to survive it. Every Stegosaurus walking around carried 4 spikes that could kill a predator, and at least once, one of them did exactly that. And the second brain thing, I love coming back to it because it's such a perfect example of how science refines a story without throwing out the real part. The popular version, the second brain in the butt, is technically not accurate. It wasn't a brain doing independent thinking. But the people who came up with that idea weren't making something up out of nothing. They were looking at a genuine, measurable physical feature, a real enlarged cavity in the hip region of the spine where the nerve tissue swelled out. The interpretation evolved, but the feature was always real. And then you find out that the same structure exists in modern birds, helping with the coordination of the back end of the body, and suddenly this quirky old fun fact becomes a serious clue. It's another bone, so to speak, connecting the dinosaurs to the birds. Everywhere you look in this story, the hollow bones of the sauropods, the spinal enlargement of the Stegosaurus, the feathers of Archaeopteryx, the threads keep tying back to the animals that are still alive. Which brings the whole thing full circle, doesn't it? We started with a world tearing itself apart, a planet poisoning its own air, 3/4 of life dying. And we end with the realization that the lineage born from that catastrophe is still here, perched on a wire, building nests, singing at dawn. The Jurassic is not a closed book. It's the opening chapter of a story that's still being written, because the dinosaurs are still here. They just wear feathers and call it flying now. And that's the thing I want to leave you holding as we keep going. Turns out the most powerful idea in all of this isn't how big or how fierce or how long ago. It's continuity. The deep, unbroken thread running from the burrowing survivors of a dying supercontinent up through the giants and the armored tanks and the first feathered flyer in a Bavarian lagoon, all the way to the bird outside your window right now. 56 million years of it. A catastrophe at the start, flight at the end, and a line of living dinosaurs that never quite let go. The Jurassic didn't end. It just learned to fly. Okay, so let me take you somewhere new, because I've been telling you about the giants and the spike-tailed tanks and the first bird, but I haven't actually put you on the ground in this world the way it deserves. And the Jurassic landscape is genuinely alien. If you got dropped into it right now, the first thing that would hit you isn't the dinosaurs at all. It's the silence in a weird, specific way. Because here's a fact that messes with your head. There were no flowers. None. Not a single bloom anywhere on the entire planet. No grass either. Imagine that. Picture this. You're standing in the middle of a Jurassic forest, and there is not one flower, not one blade of grass in any direction on the whole earth. Let me explain, because this is one of those things that quietly reshapes everything. Flowering plants, the technical name is angiosperms, but you can just think of them as basically every flower, every fruit, every blade of grass, every leafy crop you've ever seen. They hadn't evolved yet during the heart of the Jurassic. They show up later. So the world the sauropods walked through was built out of much older plants. Ferns, some of them tree-sized, towering up like green umbrellas. Cycads, which look kind of like a cross between a palm and a pineapple. Ginkgos, the same family as the ginkgo tree you might see on a city street today, one of the great survivors of deep time. And conifers, the evergreens, the cone-bearing trees, relatives of pines and redwoods and monkey puzzle trees. That was the menu. That was the whole salad bar for those 70-ton giants. No fruit, no flowers, no grass, just deep, ancient green. And here's why that matters beyond just being a cool image. The food shapes the eater. Those old plants, ferns, cycads, conifer needles, they're tough. They're fibrous, hard to digest, not exactly packed with quick energy the way fruit is. So if you're a giant herbivore trying to fuel a 70-ton body on a diet of leathery leaves and pine needles, you need a serious processing system. You need to eat enormous quantities, and you need a gut that can ferment all that fiber slowly over a long time to wring out every last bit of energy. That's part of why the sauropods got so big in the first place. A bigger body holds a bigger gut, and a bigger gut ferments tougher food more efficiently. So the very plants of the Jurassic helped drive the evolution of the largest animals that ever lived. The salad created the giants. Everything connects. And think about the neck again in that context. We talked about how a long neck is an engineering nightmare for the heart and the blood pressure. But why have it at all? Why not just be a big body with a normal neck? Well, when your world is full of tall conifers and tree ferns, and you've got competitors munching everything at ground level, the smart move is to reach where nobody else can reach. That long neck let the sauropods graze the high canopy, the tops of trees, an entire food source that was basically theirs alone. Some of them may have also used those necks to sweep a huge area of low ground without moving their massive bodies much, saving energy. Either way, the neck was a key to a locked pantry. The Jurassic forest was tall, and the sauropods grew the tools to harvest the height. The trees got big, so the necks got long. An arms race written in wood and bone. Now, here's the crazy part about the climate, because it ties the whole scene together. The Jurassic was, for the most part, a warm world, a genuinely hot, humid, greenhouse planet. Remember all that carbon dioxide the splitting continents pumped out at the very beginning? That gas is a heat trapper. It hangs in the atmosphere and keeps the warmth in. So even as life recovered, the world stayed toasty. There were no permanent ice caps at the poles the way we have today. The whole planet ran hotter and steamier, more tropical, more like a giant greenhouse from end to end. That warmth is exactly what big, cold-tolerant, no-need plants love, and it's part of why the vegetation grew so lush and the animals could grow so large. A warm world with abundant plant growth is a buffet for giant herbivores, and a buffet for giant herbivores is a hunting ground for giant predators. The heat fed the green fed the giants fed the hunters. Top to bottom, the whole pyramid was built on that ancient greenhouse warmth. And speaking of the breakup of the continents, because that wasn't a one-time event at the start, it kept going through the whole period. This slow tearing apart of Pangaea did something really important to life on Earth. As the supercontinents split, the pieces drifted apart, and new seaways opened up between them. Water flooded into the gaps, and that changed everything. Because when you split one giant landmass into separate chunks separated by ocean, you split the populations of animals living on them too. Groups that used to be one big connected population suddenly got cut off from each other by water they couldn't cross. And once they're isolated, they start evolving in different directions, adapting to their own separate pieces of the world. So the breakup of Pangaea wasn't just geology, it was an engine of diversity. It took one world's worth of animals and started slicing it into many, each going its own way. The map of life was being redrawn by the map of the land. Those new seas mattered for another reason too, and this is a side of the Jurassic that people forget about because they're so fixated on the land giants. The oceans of the Jurassic were absolutely teeming with monsters of their own. Here's the thing, while the dinosaurs ruled the land, they never really conquered the sea. The water belonged to other reptiles entirely, and some of them were terrifying. Let me put you in the water for a second. Picture this. You're swimming in a warm, shallow Jurassic sea, and gliding past you is something that looks almost exactly like a dolphin, sleek, streamlined, with a long pointed snout full of teeth and big eyes. But it's not a dolphin. It's not even a mammal. It's a reptile. These were the ichthyosaurs, which means fish lizards, and they were reptiles that had gone so completely back to the ocean that they evolved a body shape almost identical to dolphins, even though dolphins wouldn't even exist for over 100 million years. That's one of the most striking examples of what scientists call convergent evolution. Two completely different families of animals, separated by 100 million years, both solving the problem of how to be a fast ocean hunter, and both arriving at almost the exact same shape. Because physics only allows so many ways to be a sleek, fast swimmer, and both the reptile and the mammal found the same answer. The ocean kept demanding the same body, and life kept building it twice. And some of these ichthyosaurs had eyes that were genuinely enormous, among the largest eyes of any animal ever. Why? Because they were diving deep, down into the dark where almost no light reaches, hunting in the gloom. Big eyes gather more light, so down in the cold, dark depths, those huge eyes let them see prey that would be invisible to anything else. So you've got these dolphin-shaped reptiles plunging into the deep dark of the Jurassic Ocean, hunting with eyes the size of dinner plates. The sea had its own giants, its own specialists, its own arms race, running in parallel to everything happening on land. And it wasn't just the dolphin-shaped ones. The Jurassic seas had the plesiosaurs too. These are the long-necked ones, the body shape that people associate with the Loch Ness Monster legend. Picture a broad, turtle-like body, 4 big flippers like paddles, and an impossibly long neck with a small head on the end. They swam by flapping those 4 flippers almost like underwater wings, a kind of flying through the water. And then there were the short-necked, big-headed versions, the pliosaurs, which were the true apex predators of the Jurassic Sea. Massive skulls, jaws lined with conical teeth, bite forces that could crush almost anything else in the water. If a sauropod was the king of the Jurassic land, a giant pliosaur was the tyrant of the Jurassic Sea, and the two never met, because one ruled the green world and the other ruled the blue. Now here's something I want you to sit with, because it corrects a really common mistake. People lump all of these together and call them dinosaurs. The swimming ones, the flying ones, all of it. Dinosaurs, right? Wrong. And this matters. The ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs in the sea were not dinosaurs. The flying reptiles in the sky, which I'll get to in a second, were also not dinosaurs. They were all reptiles, sure, all part of the great age of reptiles. But dinosaur is a specific group with a specific set of features, mostly defined by the structure of their hips and the way their legs stand directly underneath their bodies, rather than sprawling out to the sides like a crocodile. So, the true dinosaurs walked tall, legs straight down, an upright posture. The sea monsters and the sky reptiles were cousins, members of the same broad reptilian family reunion, but they weren't dinosaurs proper. So next time someone calls a swimming plesiosaur a dinosaur, well, now you've got the actual story. And the actual story is more interesting, because it means the age of reptiles wasn't one group conquering everything. It was several different reptile lineages, each conquering a different realm. Dinosaurs took the land, other reptiles took the sea, and others took the sky. Which brings me to the sky, because the Jurassic air was not empty either. Long before Archaeopteryx ever flapped its feathered wings, something else was already flying, and it was strange and magnificent. The pterosaurs. These were the flying reptiles, the ones with wings made of skin stretched over an enormously elongated finger. Think about that for a second. A bat makes its wing out of skin stretched between several fingers, but a pterosaur made its entire wing out of skin stretched along one massively long finger, running the whole length of the wing. A single, extraordinarily extended digit holding up a membrane of skin. It's a completely different solution to flight than either bats or birds. 3 different times in history, vertebrates have evolved powered flight. The pterosaurs first, then the birds, then the bats. And all 3 did it in a totally different way. Pterosaurs with the one long finger, birds with feathers, bats with the webbed hand. 3 independent inventions of flight, 3 different blueprints, all in the same family tree of backboned animals. And here's the crazy part about the pterosaurs, and remember, this is just the Jurassic. They get truly enormous later. Even by this time, they had mastered the air. They had hollow, air-filled bones to keep them light, just like the sauropods, just like modern birds. There's that hollow bone trick showing up yet again across totally different animals, because when you need to be either gigantic or airborne, lightening your skeleton with air pockets is one of nature's go-to solutions. So you've got pterosaurs soaring over the Jurassic seas, snatching fish from the water, ruling the air with leathery wings, while down below the ichthyosaurs hunt in the deep and the dinosaurs thunder across the land. 3 kingdoms, 3 sets of rulers, all reptiles, all part of one explosive moment in the history of life. Now let me bring it back to the land and the dinosaurs themselves, because I want to talk about the predators properly. We touched on Allosaurus earlier, the one that ended up with a stegosaurus spike through its spine. But Allosaurus deserves a real introduction, because in the Jurassic, this was the apex predator on land, the big one, the one everything else feared. This is before Tyrannosaurus. T-Rex doesn't show up until much, much later, tens of millions of years after the Jurassic ends. So if you're picturing the classic giant predator of this age, picture Allosaurus. Big skull, walking on 2 powerful legs, short but strong arms tipped with 3 vicious clawed fingers. Unlike the famously tiny 2-fingered arms of T-Rex, the Allosaurus had real, usable, grabbing hands with hooked claws. A serious, well-equipped hunter. And here's an interesting twist on how Allosaurus killed. Its skull and jaws weren't built to deliver one massive crushing bite the way T-Rex's would later be. Instead, the evidence suggests Allosaurus used its head almost like a hatchet, opening its jaws extraordinarily wide and then driving its upper teeth down into prey with a powerful downward strike, slashing and hacking rather than crushing. Its mouth could open to a startlingly wide angle, and the muscles were arranged to power that downward chop. So picture this, an Allosaurus closing in on a wounded animal, gaping its jaws open wide, and bringing its tooth-lined upper jaw down like an axe, again and again, tearing away flesh with each strike. A different style of killing entirely, a slashing hunter, a living hatchet on two legs. And yet, for all that power, we know from that one beautiful piece of evidence that even the great Allosaurus could come off worse against a Stegosaurus that swung its tail at the right moment. The apex predator wasn't invincible. It lived a dangerous life too. And here's a detail about Allosaurus that paints a vivid picture of the world it lived in. At certain fossil sites, paleontologists have found the remains of huge numbers of Allosaurus packed together in one place, way more than you'd expect from chance. One famous site in particular has yielded the bones of dozens of individual Allosaurus, far more than any of the plant eaters found there. The leading idea about why is grim and fascinating. The thinking is that this may have been a kind of predator trap, maybe a patch of mud or bog where an animal got stuck and died, and its struggling and the smell of its body attracted hungry Allosaurus, which came in to feed and then got stuck themselves, which then attracted more predators, and so on, a deadly cycle that piled up the corpses of one hunter after another. So you've got this snapshot of a world where the predators were so numerous and so driven by hunger that they'd walk straight into a death trap chasing a meal. It tells you how hard the hunting life was. Even at the top of the food chain, you were one bad decision away from being part of the fossil record yourself. Now, speaking of the variety of dinosaurs, let me round out the cast a bit, because the Jurassic wasn't only the long-necked giants and the big slashing predators. There was a whole spectrum of animals filling every role. There were the ornithopods, smaller to medium plant eaters that often ran on two legs, quick and agile, the deer and antelope of their day, always alert, always ready to bolt. There were the early armored dinosaurs beyond just Stegosaurus, ankylosaur relatives starting to develop the bony plating that their descendants would turn into living tanks. There were small, fast, clever predators, the smaller cousins of the big meat-eaters, the kind of nimble hunters that scurried through the underbrush, snatching up little prey. And critically, it's among these small, agile, two-legged predators that the bird story really lives. Because Archaeopteryx, the first bird we talked about, didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of exactly this group, the small, feathered, fast-moving theropod dinosaurs. The bird is a refined, lightened, flight-tuned version of the little Jurassic hunter. The same family that gave you the slashing Allosaurus, scaled down and feathered up, gave you the first thing in the sky with a true bird's heart. And that's a connection I want to drive home, because it reframes the predators entirely. When you look at Allosaurus, you might think you're looking at the opposite of a bird, a scaly monster, a reptile, a killing machine. But you're actually looking at a distant relative of every eagle and hawk and falcon that has ever lived. The theropods, the two-legged predatory dinosaurs, are the branch of the family that birds come from. So the fierce, hooked claws of the Allosaurus and the talons of a modern hawk are cousins. The slashing jaws of the predator and the snapping beak of the eagle are echoes of the same lineage. The hunters of the Jurassic land are the ancestors of the hunters of the modern sky. The dinosaur never stopped being a predator, it just took to the air. Let me pull back again and talk about time, because I keep coming back to it and I think it's the thing that's hardest for human brains to hold. We covered that the Jurassic lasted about 56 million years, but here's something even more dizzying. The Jurassic is just one of three great periods in the age of the dinosaurs. Before it came the Triassic, when the dinosaurs first appeared and were still minor players. The Jurassic is the middle act, when they came into their own and grew into giants. And after it comes the Cretaceous, the final and longest act, which is when a lot of the most famous dinosaurs you know, T-Rex, Triceratops, the really iconic ones, actually lived. And that's a thing people get wrong all the time. Stegosaurus and T-Rex never met. They're separated by an absolutely vast gulf of time. The Stegosaurus lived in the Jurassic, and the T-Rex lived near the very end of the Cretaceous, and the time between those two animals is greater than the time between T-Rex and you. Let that one rattle around in your skull. A Tyrannosaurus rex is closer in time to a person scrolling on their phone today than it is to a stegosaurus. The popular image of all the dinosaurs hanging out together in one big prehistoric party is completely wrong. They're spread across a stretch of time so enormous that some of them are as distant from each other as they are from us. So when you hold the Jurassic in your mind, you have to hold it as its own complete world, with its own specific cast, its own climate, its own geography. It is not the world of T-Rex. It is the earlier world of Allosaurus and Stegosaurus and Brachiosaurus and Archaeopteryx, a warm, flowerless, breaking apart planet of ferns and conifers and ancient seas full of dolphin-shaped reptiles. A self-contained chapter, 56 million years long, with a beginning and a middle and an end all its own. Now here's the crazy part about how we even know any of this with such precision. Let me explain how the dating actually works, because it's genuinely brilliant and most people have no idea. When you hear a scientist say this animal lived 200 million years ago, you might wonder how on earth anyone could possibly know that. It's not a guess, it's physics. Certain rocks, especially volcanic ones, contain radioactive elements that decay at a perfectly steady, known rate, ticking down like a clock that can never be stopped or sped up. By measuring how much of the original radioactive material is left versus how much has decayed into its end product, scientists can calculate exactly how long that clock has been running. In other words, how old the rock is. And because the Jurassic began and ended with so much volcanic activity, there's plenty of that datable rock to read. So the dates aren't vibes. They're the readout of atomic clocks ticking inside the stone for hundreds of millions of years. The Earth kept time, and we learned to read the dial. And that connects back to everything we've talked about. The mercury spikes that proved the poisoning at the start of the Jurassic, read in the rock. The dates that tell us when the extinction happened, read by atomic clocks in volcanic stone. The fine limestone that preserved every feather on Archaeopteryx, a specific kind of rock from a specific lagoon. The bones of the giants, the puncture wound in the Allosaurus spine, the piled-up predators in the death trap, all of it stone, all of it physical, all of it sitting there for 150 million years, waiting to be read. The Jurassic didn't just happen and vanish. It wrote itself into the rock in a dozen different languages, and slowly, painstakingly, we've learned to read every one of them. Let me circle back to that idea of the warm greenhouse world one more time, because there's a sobering edge to it that's worth sitting with. The Jurassic was hot because of all that carbon dioxide in the air, and the life of the Jurassic adapted to that heat over millions and millions of years, slowly, gradually, generation by generation. The plants, the animals, the whole ecosystem grew up in a warm world and was built for it. But remember how the period began with that catastrophe of suddenly released carbon dioxide and the mass extinction it caused. The difference between the warm world that life thrived in and the killing surge that wiped out 3/4 of species wasn't really about heat being bad in itself. It was about speed. When the change is slow, life adapts. When the change is sudden, when that 100,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide hits the air fast, life can't keep up, and it dies. The Jurassic teaches you that lesson in stone. The same gas that made the world a lush paradise, when released too fast, became the deadliest poison the planet had seen. It's not the warmth, it's the shock. The planet has always been able to handle change. What it can't handle is change that comes faster than life can answer. And that's why, when you really study the Jurassic, you come away with this strange double feeling. On one hand, it's a story of triumph, life recovering from near total annihilation, exploding into the most magnificent creatures the land has ever held, conquering the sea and the sky and the ground, growing to the very limits of what physics allows, and finally lifting off into flight. But on the other hand, it opens with a stark warning about how fragile it all is, how quickly a thriving world can be tipped into collapse when the chemistry of the air changes too fast. Triumph born from catastrophe, and catastrophe written in the same chemistry that, Much later, we'd start playing with ourselves. The Jurassic is a mirror, if you're willing to look into it. But let's not end this stretch on the heavy note, because the Jurassic is, above everything, a story of life winning. Let me leave you back in the scene one more time. Picture this. The sun is setting over a Jurassic landscape. The light is golden, slanting through the fronds of giant ferns and the branches of ancient conifers. A herd of sauropods moves slowly across an open plain, their necks swaying, their footsteps shaking the ground, the biggest animals that will ever walk the earth going about their evening. In the distance, a stegosaurus lifts its plated back as the light catches it. Far overhead, a pterosaur wheels against the darkening sky, leathery wings spread wide. And somewhere in the underbrush, small and quick and feathered, a little theropod darts between the ferns, and if you could see it clearly, you'd notice how much it looks like a bird, because it nearly is one. The whole world is humming with life that climbed out of an apocalypse and built something staggering. And the most incredible part is that the story doesn't end here. That little feathered runner in the bushes carries the future inside it. Its descendants will outlast the giants, outlast the predators, outlast the very age they were born in, and they'll still be here, flying over your head, 150 million years later. The Jurassic isn't the past, it's the prologue. Now, I want to slow down and really get inside the bodies of these animals, because so far I've been telling you what they were and how big they got, but I haven't told you what it was actually like to be one of them. And once you start thinking about the day-to-day reality of being a 70-ton sauropod, the questions get weird fast. Like, how did something that big even breathe? How did it not cook itself alive from the inside? How did it have babies? Stick with me, because this is where the giants go from being statues in a museum to being living, breathing, problem-solving creatures. And every answer connects back to the birds, again and again. Let's start with breathing, because this one is genuinely beautiful. You and I breathe in a pretty simple way. Air goes in, fills our lungs like a pair of balloons, then we breathe out and the same air comes back the way it went in and out, same passage, two-way traffic. And that works fine for us. But for a giant animal, that system has a problem. Every breath, a chunk of stale, used-up air stays behind in your lungs and mixes with the fresh air, so you never get a fully clean breath. Now here's the crazy part. Birds don't breathe like we do. Birds have a one-way breathing system. Air flows through their lungs in a single direction, looping through a network of air sacs that act like bellows, so that fresh, oxygen-rich air is moving across the lungs almost constantly, even when the bird breathes out. It's a far more efficient system than ours. It's part of how birds can fly at altitudes where the air is so thin that a human would pass out. And the evidence strongly suggests that the sauropods and other dinosaurs had this exact same kind of breathing system. Remember those hollow, air-filled bones we keep coming back to? Those air spaces weren't just for lightening the skeleton. They were part of the air sac system, the same bellows network that birds use today. So that 70-ton giant was breathing with a bird's lungs, drawing fresh air through its body in a constant one-way stream, which is exactly the kind of high-performance breathing you'd need to fuel a body that enormous. The dinosaur breathed like a bird tens of millions of years before there were birds. Or really, the bird breathes like a dinosaur, because it inherited the whole system. Now here's the next problem, and it's a big one. Heat. When you're a small animal, getting rid of excess body heat is easy. You've got a lot of surface area, your skin, compared to your volume, so heat escapes quickly. But as an animal gets bigger, its volume grows much faster than its surface area. Think about it. Double the size of a body and its volume goes up 8-fold, but its surface only goes up 4-fold. So the bigger you get, the harder it is to dump heat, because you've got all this internal volume generating warmth and proportionally less skin to let it escape. Now scale that up to 70 tons. A sauropod should have been in serious danger of overheating, of basically cooking itself from the inside out, because all that mass of muscle and gut and fermenting plant matter was generating heat with nowhere easy for it to go. So how did they survive? This is where that long neck and long tail come back into the story with a second job. All that extra surface area, the long neck, the long tail, the air sacs threaded through the body, gave the animal more ways to shed heat, more radiator surface to bleed off warmth. The very features that let the sauropod reach high food and grow to record size may also have helped solve the deadly problem of staying cool. Everything about the giant body was a balancing act, every feature doing double and triple duty, the whole thing engineered right up to the limits of what's possible. And here's a question that always stops people in their tracks. How does a 70-ton animal have babies? Because here's the thing, it doesn't give birth to a 70-ton baby. It can't. So the sauropods laid eggs. And their eggs, relative to the size of the adult, were surprisingly small. We're talking about an animal the size of a building laying eggs you could comfortably hold. Eggs maybe the size of a soccer ball at most, often smaller. Picture this. The largest creature ever to walk the earth begins its life small enough to fit in your hands. And that creates a wild reality. A baby sauropod and an adult sauropod were so radically different in size. We're talking the difference between something you could pick up and something that weighs more than 10 elephants, that they almost certainly lived completely different lives. The babies probably hid in the underbrush, ate different food, faced totally different dangers than the adults. A young sauropod had to grow through every size class on its way up, starting as easy prey for small predators and ending as an animal so massive that nothing on Earth could threaten it. It had to run the entire gauntlet of the food chain in a single lifetime, starting at the bottom and, if it survived, ending utterly at the top. The growth rate to get there must have been staggering. To go from a hatchling you could hold to a 70-ton adult, these animals had to grow at an absolutely furious pace, packing on weight faster than almost any animal alive today. And we know this isn't a guess because you can read growth in bone. Just like a tree has rings, dinosaur bones laid down growth marks as the animal aged, and by counting and measuring them, scientists can clock how fast these giants grew and roughly how long they lived. The bone keeps the record. The body remembers its own childhood, and we can read it. And think about the strategy there, because it's so different from a mammal. A mammal like an elephant has a few babies and invests heavily in each one, carrying them for years, protecting them. A sauropod almost certainly went the other way, laying lots of eggs and letting the numbers do the work. Most hatchlings would die young, picked off by predators, but a few would survive the gauntlet and grow into untouchable giants. It's a numbers game played across a lifetime, and it worked because these animals dominated the planet for tens of millions of years. The strategy of starting tiny and growing colossal, of flooding the world with eggs and letting a lucky few climb all the way to the top, that was the secret engine behind the reign of the giants. Now let me turn back to the predators and the question of intelligence and behavior, because there's a lot of fascinating stuff here that gets glossed over. We tend to picture the big meat eaters as mindless killing machines, but the evidence paints a more interesting picture. Take those slashing predators, the theropods. Their brains, relative to their bodies, were larger and more sophisticated than those of the giant plant eaters. The hunting life demands it. To stalk prey, to time an ambush, to react to a fleeing animal or a swinging spiked tail, you need fast reflexes, good senses, and decent processing power. And here's where it ties back to the birds yet again, because the part of the brain that grew especially large in these hunting dinosaurs is connected to the same kind of brain development you see in birds, which are, pound for pound, some of the smartest animals alive. So the cleverness of a crow or a parrot, that surprising intelligence we marvel at in birds, has roots running all the way back to the sharp-minded hunters of the dinosaur age. The predator's brain was the bird's brain in an earlier draft. And let's talk about senses, because the way these animals experienced the world was shaped by what they needed to survive. The big predators likely had an excellent sense of smell. Some of them had large parts of the brain devoted to processing scent, which means they could probably detect prey, or a carcass, from a long distance, following the smell across the landscape the way a vulture homes in on death today. Their vision was probably sharp too, especially forward-facing for judging distance to prey, the way a hunting animal needs to know exactly how far away its target is before it lunges. Meanwhile, the plant eaters were built the opposite way, eyes set more to the sides of the head for a wide field of view, always watching for danger coming from any direction, the way a deer or a horse scans constantly for threats today. Predator eyes face forward to hunt. Prey eyes face sideways to watch. You can read an animal's whole way of life just from where its eyes sit in its skull, and the Jurassic animals tell that same story we still see in the living world. Now, speaking of how these animals live together, did the predators hunt alone or in groups? This is a genuinely debated question, and the evidence is tantalizing. Remember that predator trap site I mentioned, with dozens of Allosaurus piled up together? One interpretation of finds like that, and of other sites where multiple predators are found together, is that at least some of these hunters may have lived or hunted in groups, at least some of the time. Now, that's not settled. It's possible they were just drawn individually to the same carcass or the same trap, rather than cooperating. But the idea of pack-hunting dinosaurs, of coordinated groups bringing down prey too big for any single hunter, is at least on the table for some species. And if it's true, it adds a whole new dimension of menace to the Jurassic. Imagine not one slashing predator coming at a herd of plant eaters, but several, working the edges, cutting off escape, ganging up on a straggler. The social lives of these animals are one of the hardest things to reconstruct from bones. But every now and then the rock gives us a hint, and the hints suggest a world richer and more complicated than the lone monster image we grew up with. Let me come back to the plant eaters and their defenses, because the Stegosaurus and its spiked tail were just one solution to the eternal problem of not getting eaten. Across the Jurassic, the herbivores evolved an entire arsenal of survival strategies, and it's worth appreciating the variety. Some, like the sauropods, went the route of pure size, grow so big that nothing can bring you down, and use a long, muscular, whip-like tail as a deterrent. And here's a fascinating idea about those sauropod tails. Some of them were so long and thin at the tip that when cracked like a whip, they might have moved fast enough to produce a loud, sharp sound, like a sonic boom in miniature. Picture that, a giant sauropod snapping its tail through the air with a deafening crack to warn off a predator or signal to its herd. We can't be certain they did this, but the physics of those tails makes it possible, and it's a wonderful image, the largest animals on Earth communicating or defending themselves with a thunderclap. Other plant eaters went the route of armor, the way Stegosaurus did with its plates and spikes, and its relatives did with growing bony shields embedded in their skin. Others went the route of speed and alertness, the smaller two-legged plant eaters that couldn't fight and couldn't tank a hit, so they relied on watching constantly and bolting at the first sign of danger, fast enough to outrun a predator over open ground. Every herbivore in the Jurassic was running a different answer to the same question, the question every prey animal in history has had to answer. How do I not become someone's dinner? Some answered with size, some with armor, some with weapons, some with speed, and the predators in turn evolved to counter each defense, and the prey evolved to counter the counter, around and around, an arms race that drove the whole spectacular diversity of the age. The giants and the spikes and the slashing jaws and the watchful eyes are all moves in the same endless game. Now let me return to those plates on the Stegosaurus's back for a moment, because there's more to them than I led on earlier, and it's a great example of how science keeps refining its understanding. For a long time, people assumed those big diamond-shaped plates were primarily armor, protection for the spine and back. But there's a problem with that idea. The plates weren't actually positioned well to protect the sides of the animal, where a predator would most likely attack, And they weren't solid, dense bone like you'd want for a shield. So what were they for? Two leading ideas, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is display. The plates may have been a way to look bigger and more intimidating to predators, or to show off to potential mates, or to identify members of the same species to each other. A stegosaurus with its plates lit up by the sun would look enormous and impressive, and that alone might make a predator think twice. The other idea is temperature regulation. The plates were threaded through with channels for blood vessels, which means blood could flow through them. And a structure full of blood vessels with a large surface area exposed to the air is exactly what you'd build if you wanted to either soak up warmth from the sun or shed excess heat. A living radiator, or a living solar panel, sticking up off the animal's back. Turn the plates toward the morning sun to warm up, angle them into the breeze to cool down. So the iconic plates of the Stegosaurus may not have been armor at all, but some combination of billboard and thermostat, a way to communicate and a way to manage body temperature. And there's that heat problem again, the eternal challenge of being a large animal, solved in yet another creative way. Let me zoom out and talk about something that I think is genuinely underappreciated about the whole age of dinosaurs. And that's just how successful they were, in a way no land animals have ever matched before or since. We've established the time scale, but let me hammer it home from a different angle. Mammals, us, our whole class of animals, have been the dominant land animals for a long stretch since the dinosaurs' reign ended. But the dinosaurs ruled the land for far, far longer than mammals have. The dinosaurs were the masters of the terrestrial world for well over 150 million years across all three of their periods. That is a span of dominance that dwarfs anything else in the history of land animals. They weren't a brief experiment that nature tried and discarded. They were the single most successful group of large land animals that has ever existed, by a margin that isn't even close. And the Jurassic is the golden middle of that reign, the chapter where they truly came into their full power and variety. When you stand in a museum and look up at a sauropod skeleton, you're not looking at an evolutionary dead end or a failed design. You're looking at the form that won the planet more thoroughly and for longer than any large land animal ever has. The dinosaurs weren't lucky losers. They were the most enduring champions the land has ever produced, and one branch of them is still champion of the sky right now. Now here's a thought that I find genuinely humbling, and it brings together a lot of what we've covered. For most of human history, we had no idea any of this ever happened. None. People dug up giant bones for thousands of years and had no framework to understand them. Some scholars thought they were the bones of giants from old legends, or dragons, or the victims of an ancient flood. The very idea that the world was once ruled by enormous alien creatures that no human ever laid eyes on, that entire ages came and went before our species existed, that the Earth had a deep, deep history stretching back hundreds of millions of years. That idea is actually pretty recent. The word dinosaur itself was only coined in the 1800s. For the vast majority of the time humans have existed, we walked over the buried bones of the giants and never knew what we were standing on. And then, in a remarkably short stretch of time, we figured it out. We learned to read the rock, to date the stone with atomic clocks, to reconstruct entire lost worlds from fragments of fossilized bone, to trace the family tree of life from a feathered creature in a Bavarian quarry all the way to the pigeon on the windowsill. That's an astonishing thing for a species to accomplish. We pieced together a 56 million year chapter of a story that ended long before we began, using nothing but the clues the Earth left behind. And every fossil we pull from the ground adds another sentence to a tale we very nearly never knew we were part of. Because that's the real punchline, isn't it? We are part of this story. Not the dinosaur part directly. Our own ancestors during the Jurassic were small, scurrying creatures, little mammals living in the shadows of the giants, hiding in burrows, coming out at night, staying small and out of the way while the dinosaurs ruled the daylight world. Picture that for a second. While the sauropods thundered across the plains and the Allosaurus hunted and the first birds took to the air, your distant ancestors were tiny, furry things no bigger than a rat, darting between the ferns, eating insects, surviving by being small and quiet and unnoticed. The whole future of mammals, the entire line that would eventually lead to you, spent the glory days of the dinosaurs as bit players, as background extras, as the small things hiding underfoot. And there's a strange poetry in that, because it mirrors exactly how the dinosaurs themselves got their start, as small survivors waiting in the wings. The little mammals of the Jurassic were doing the same thing the early dinosaurs had done before them, biding their time, staying small and tough, waiting for their own lottery ticket. They wouldn't win it in the Jurassic. They wouldn't win it for a very long time. But they were there, watching, surviving, carrying the seed of everything that would come after. The age of the giants was also, quietly, the nursery of the age of mammals. Both stories were unfolding at once, the loud one and the silent one, the giants in the sun and the small things in the dark. And that's why I keep saying the Jurassic isn't really the past. It's the foundation. The breathing system of the birds was forged there. The intelligence of the crow was drafted there. The body plan of every flying thing with feathers was prototyped there. And the small, patient survival strategy that would eventually carry mammals to dominance was being quietly rehearsed there too, in the burrows under the giants' feet. Everything alive on land today, the birds in the sky and the mammals on the ground, including you, traces some thread of its story back through that warm, flowerless, breaking apart world. The giants are gone, but the world they helped build is the one we're standing in. The Jurassic ended, but it never really left. Let me leave you with one more scene before we move on, because I want you to hold the full picture in your mind. Picture this. It's night in the Jurassic. The giants have settled, dark shapes resting under a sky absolutely blazing with stars. Far more stars than you'll ever see from a modern city. An unpolluted sky from end to end. And down in the underbrush, two sets of small eyes are moving. One belongs to a little feathered theropod, the ancestor of birds, hunting insects in the dark. The other belongs to a tiny mammal, the ancestor of you, doing the exact same thing just a few feet away. Two small survivors, two futures, sharing the same patch of Jurassic night under the resting giants. Neither of them knows what's coming. Neither of them knows that one will inherit the sky and the other will inherit the ground, that their descendants will still be here 150 million years from now, long after the giants have turned to stone. They're just two small things surviving in the dark, but the whole future is sitting right there in those four little eyes. And that, more than the giants, more than the spikes, more than the 70 tons, is the thing about the Jurassic that should stay with you. The biggest story wasn't the biggest animals. It was the smallest ones, waiting in the dark, carrying everything that was still to come. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time inside the Jurassic world, but I want to use this last stretch to do something a little different. I want to take everything we've learned and walk it forward, follow the threads all the way out, and show you how this 56 million year chapter actually ends and what it leaves behind. Because the Jurassic doesn't just stop, it hands off. And understanding the handoff is where the whole story finally clicks into place. Let me explain. As the Jurassic drew toward its close, the world kept changing in the same slow, grinding way it had all along. The continents kept drifting apart, the seaways kept widening, the climate kept shifting. And life kept doing what life does, adapting, diversifying, filling every nook. By the end of the Jurassic, the dinosaurs had reached an absolute peak of size and variety on land. The seas were ruled by their reptilian monsters, the skies belonged to the pterosaurs, and the first birds had taken wing. It was, by almost any measure, a triumph. The planet that had nearly killed itself 56 million years earlier was now bursting with the most spectacular life it had ever held. And then the Jurassic gave way to the next chapter, the Cretaceous, and the story rolled on without missing a beat. There was no great catastrophe at the end of the Jurassic the way there had been at the beginning. The giants simply carried their reign forward into the next age. The famous ending, the asteroid, the great extinction that finally toppled the dinosaurs, that's still tens of millions of years in the future from where the Jurassic leaves off. That's a different story for a different day. The Jurassic itself ends not with a bang, but with a handoff. The baton of the world passed smoothly from one age of giants to the next. But here's the thing I really want you to sit with, the idea that I think is the true heart of this whole story. Throughout everything we've covered, the breathing, the bones, the brains, the eggs, the heat radiators, the feathers, one thread keeps surfacing again and again, no matter where we look. And that thread is the bird. Every single time we dug into how these animals actually worked, we found something that's still alive today, walking around or flying overhead in the form of birds. The one-way breathing, the air-filled bones, the clever, capable brain, the spinal enlargement in the hips, the feathers, obviously. The wishbone, and yes, that's another one, the wishbone you pull apart on a holiday bird, that started in dinosaurs too, a fused collarbone that the predatory dinosaurs had long before any bird existed. Over and over, the things we think of as bird traits turn out to be dinosaur traits that birds inherited. And that's not a coincidence or a fun bit of trivia. It's the single most important fact in all of paleontology, and it deserves to be stated as plainly as possible. Birds are not the descendants of dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs. They are a living, breathing, flying branch of the exact same family tree, the part of the lineage that never died. Let that really land, because it changes how you see the world. The next time you're sitting on your couch and a sparrow lands on the windowsill, or a pigeon struts across the sidewalk, or you hear a crow calling from a rooftop, you're not looking at a distant relative of the dinosaurs. You're looking at a dinosaur. Full stop. A small, feathered, modern dinosaur going about its day. The chicken in your kitchen is a dinosaur. The duck on the pond is a dinosaur. The hawk circling over the highway is a dinosaur, hunting the way its ancestors hunted, with forward-facing eyes and hooked talons and a sharp predatory mind, all inherited from the slashing theropods of the Jurassic. The dinosaurs never went extinct. The big ones did, eventually, much later. But the lineage itself? It's everywhere. It's outside your window right now. There are more species of living dinosaurs flying around the planet today than there are species of mammals. We don't live in a world that came after the dinosaurs. We live in a world that's still full of them. We just call them birds. And I think there's something genuinely profound in that, something that reframes how you should think about extinction and survival, and what it even means for an animal to win. Because we have this tidy story in our heads. The dinosaurs ruled, the dinosaurs died, the end, a closed chapter, a tragedy. But that story is wrong, or at least it's only half true. One branch of the dinosaurs found a new way to live. It got small, it got light. It traded the path of the giant for the path of the flyer. It learned to do something none of its colossal cousins could do, to leave the ground entirely, to escape into a whole dimension that the big predators could never follow. And by doing that, it survived everything. It survived the end of the Jurassic. It survived the end of the Cretaceous. It survived the asteroid that killed off the giants. It survived every upheaval the planet has thrown at it for over 150 million years. The dinosaurs didn't lose. The biggest ones gambled everything on size and eventually lost that bet. But the small feathered ones gambled on flight, and they won so completely that they're still here, more numerous and more widespread than ever. Survival, it turns out, was never about being the biggest or the fiercest. It was about being able to change. The giants couldn't change fast enough. The birds could. And that's why there are no sauropods left, but there are birds on every continent on Earth, including Antarctica. Now let me tie this all the way back to where we started, because the symmetry of it is almost too perfect to be real. The Jurassic opened with a catastrophe, a supercontinent tearing itself apart, 100,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide poisoning the air, mercury raining into the rocks, 76% of all species wiped out. And out of that disaster, the dinosaurs rose, not because they were superior, but because they happened to be small and tough and lucky when the world ended. They won the lottery of catastrophe. And then, at the other end of their reign, when the next great catastrophe finally came, the cycle repeated, the giants fell, and a small, tough, lucky branch survived to inherit the new world. The birds won the same kind of lottery their ancestors had won at the dawn of the Jurassic. Small survives. Adaptable survives. The flexible inherit the earth again and again, while the magnificent and the massive and the seemingly invincible fall when the world changes too fast for them. The Jurassic begins and ends with the same lesson, written in different animals. It's the rhythm of life itself, catastrophe, collapse, and then the quiet survivors crawling out to build something new. And here's the part that should give you a little shiver, because it puts you in the story. Remember those tiny mammals scurrying in the underbrush during the Jurassic, the little furry things hiding in the giants' shadows, the distant ancestors of you and me? They were playing the same survival game. They were small and quiet and tough, biding their time, waiting for their lottery ticket. And eventually, long after the Jurassic, when the asteroid fell and the giants died, those small mammals got their ticket. They crawled out into an emptied world and radiated into everything: the whales, the elephants, the wolves, the apes, and finally, us. So you are the product of the exact same strategy that saved the early dinosaurs and saved the birds. You come from the small survivors who waited in the dark. Your entire existence is downstream of being small and tough and patient when the world was ruled by giants. The Jurassic isn't just the prologue to the birds, it's the prologue to you. You were there, in a sense, scurrying between the ferns, one of the small things carrying the future. And here you are, 150 million years later, a survivor's survivor, looking back at it all and finally understanding the world you came from. That's the thing about deep time that I find almost overwhelming when I really let myself feel it. We tend to think of ourselves as separate from all that ancient stuff, as if the dinosaurs are a fantasy world that has nothing to do with us. But there is an unbroken chain of living things connecting that warm, flowerless Jurassic forest to this exact moment, right now, with you. Every one of your ancestors, going back through the mammals, back through those tiny Jurassic creatures, back and back and back, survived. Every single one of them lived long enough to pass life forward, through every extinction, every catastrophe, every change the planet threw at them. Not one link in that chain ever broke, because if it had, you wouldn't be here. You are the living end of an unbroken thread of survival, stretching back through the age of the giants, and far, far beyond it. And the birds outside your window are the living end of a parallel thread, the dinosaur thread, that ran right alongside yours the whole way. Two survivors from the same Jurassic night, still here, sharing the same world. That's not a metaphor, that's just what happened. That's the literal, physical truth of where you and that sparrow both came from. So let me bring us all the way home and gather up everything this one age gave us. The Jurassic was 56 million years long, enough time to fit all of human history more than 5,000 times over. It began with the planet tearing itself apart and nearly dying. Out of that catastrophe rose the dinosaurs, who didn't win by being superior, but by being the right, small, tough, warm-blooded survivors at the right, terrible moment. They inherited an empty world and exploded into the most magnificent creatures the land has ever held. They grew into 70-ton sauropods, the largest animals that ever walked the earth, pushing against the very limits of what physics allows, breathing with bird lungs, cooling themselves with their own long necks and tails, starting life small enough to hold in your hands and growing into living mountains. They evolved into plated, spike-tailed stegosaurus, armed with weapons we can prove worked because of a puncture wound in an Allosaurus spine that matches the spikes exactly, carrying a real enlargement of the spinal cord in their hips that connects them straight to modern birds. They were hunted by the great slashing Allosaurus, the apex predator of its world, using its head like a hatchet, sometimes so driven by hunger that whole groups of them died together in deadly traps. The seas around them teemed with dolphin-shaped ichthyosaurs and long-necked plesiosaurs and crushing plesiosaurs. The skies were ruled by pterosaurs, flying on a single impossibly long finger. The plants were ancient ferns and cycads and conifers, not a single flower or blade of grass anywhere on Earth. And quietly, in a calm lagoon in what is now Bavaria, the Jurassic produced its most important creation of all, Archaeopteryx, the first bird, caught mid-transformation with feathers and wings on one side, and teeth and a long bony tail and clawed fingers on the other, all 12 of its known specimens preserved in one perfect window of limestone. The animal that was a dinosaur becoming a bird, frozen in stone for us to find. And the punchline, the thing that makes the whole story matter, is that it never ended. The lineage that began in that lagoon is alive right now, on every continent, in every sky, in your backyard and on your plate and circling over your city. The Jurassic didn't die. It transformed. It learned to fly, and it never looked back. Every bird alive is a living dinosaur, a feathered survivor carrying 56 million years of that astonishing age forward into the present, into your present, into this very moment as you sit there and listen. So, here's what I want you to do. The next time you see a bird, any bird, a sparrow, a pigeon, a chicken, a hawk, doesn't matter. I want you to really look at it for a second. Look at the way it cocks its head, the sharp little eyes, the scaly legs, the clawed feet, the way it moves. And I want you to remember that you are not looking at a cute little animal. You are looking at the surviving heir of the Age of Giants, a direct descendant of the same family that ruled this planet more completely and for longer than any large land animals in history. The lineage that walked out of one apocalypse at the dawn of the Jurassic and flew out of another at the end of the Cretaceous, and is still here, still going, still winning. That little bird is the last living chapter of a story that began 200 million years ago with a planet tearing itself apart. And now you know what it really is. Not a bird, a dinosaur that figured out how to survive forever. That's the Jurassic. Catastrophe at the start, flight at the end, and a thread of life so stubborn it refused to ever fully break. The giants are gone, turned to stone in the museums and the rock beds of the world, but their story is still being told, every single morning, by the dinosaurs singing in the trees. And that, my friend, is just about the most incredible thing I know.